Before we begin today's program, I invite you to join me in a moment of reflection on the lives of those people who were killed in Atlanta. I apologize for the noise in the background. I'm zooming in from downtown Los Angeles, so unfortunately there may be some traffic noise that you'll hear. But I invite you to join me in reflecting on the lives of the people who were killed in Atlanta: Xiao Jin Han, Delina Ashley Yuan, Soon C. Park, Young Jung Grant, Sun Sha Kim, Young Ai Yu, Dao Yu Fang, and Paul Andre Michaels. And in addition to those individuals who were murdered, I ask you to think about transgender folks who have been killed so far this year, especially transgender women of color, people like Tayana Alexander, a Black trans woman who was killed in Chicago, Samuel Valentin, a trans man who was killed in Puerto Rico, Bianca Banks, a Black trans woman who was killed in Atlanta, and Dominique Jackson, a Black trans woman who was killed in Jackson, Mississippi. They are just 4 of at least 11 trans or gender non-conforming people who have been killed so far in 2021, just the first few months of this year. And at least 44 trans people were killed in 2020. So I'm going to ring my singing bell in just a minute to begin our moment of silence and reflection. And during that time, I really ask you to think about each of those people's lives, to remember that they were someone's child, that they were loved, that they loved in return, that they had hopes and aspirations that were cut short. In addition to honoring the memories of these people who were murdered, many of you still may need some time to process, what's been happening, and may want to take action. So we have a few suggestions for you. This coming Tuesday evening Pacific time, Kizuna, which is a group based in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles that promotes Japanese American culture among young people and young adults, and Changing Tides, a program to destigmatize mental health care in the API community. They're holding a program with the clinical psychologist, the Nikkei clinical psychologist, this coming Tuesday from 7 to 8:30 Pacific time. And Jill has just posted the link to register for that. An organization called Holla Back is providing free trainings to either intervene when you witness incidents of harassment or if you're the target of harassment. And Jill has just posted in the chat how to register for those free workshops. And then finally, there are a number of organizations that you can contribute to that are working with the impacted families and communities. One is Red Canary Song, which is a grassroots group of Chinese massage workers across the country. And AT has just posted in the chat how you can contribute to that organization. Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Georgia has set up a fund for the victims' families. And I think Jill is going to post that in just a minute, along with a link to contribute to the Transgender Law Center, which was the only organization, legal organization in the country that is defending the rights of trans people. So I hope that you will take care of yourselves and also take action. So I'm going to share my screen again, and just to explain that today's program is part of a series of programs related to the online exhibit called Seen and Unseen, Queering Japanese American History Before 1945, and the links to access that exhibit are up on the screen right now, and it will be available till June 30th. And this exhibit is also available in Japanese, and I believe the translator of the exhibit, Asako Hanafusa, is on this Zoom call. So this exhibit shares a hidden history of same-sex loving and gender non-conforming Japanese Americans who really haven't been acknowledged in the Japanese American or larger communities. Just as even today, many of us who identify as LGBTQ and Nikkei have felt that our queer identities have been actively ignored within the Japanese American community. And I imagine that this kind of seen and seen framework is a little paradoxical for transgender identified Japanese Americans, because in one sense, if they choose to manifest publicly their gender identity, they're definitely seen by their family and immediate community members because they're not presenting in the gender that they were assigned at birth. But at the same time, the larger Japanese American community really hasn't acknowledged trans and non-binary Japanese Americans, and maybe even actively denies their existence. So today's program is really a corrective, and it's meant not only to show that there are indeed transgender and non-binary Japanese Americans, but that they are leaders, not only within, but beyond the Japanese American and transgender communities. So our program today is going to be moderated by the fabulous A.T. Furuya, who is a queer transgender Yonsei, who was born and raised on Kameya'a land, also known today as San Diego. And they were the first Japanese American to receive non-binary gender marker in the US. And AT is an advocate working with a national nonprofit organization that supports LGBTQ plus inclusion at K through 12 schools throughout the country. AT is also an historian focused on Japanese American women who were incarcerated during World War II, as well as LGBTQ history. And there's a lineage in Seen and Unseen, the exhibit, that I can trace back to AT. And that is because when AT was an intern at the Japanese American Historical Society in San Diego, they discovered documents and materials related to an Issei named Isa Shimoda, who was gender non-conforming. And AT wrote an article on Isa Shimoda and alerted scholar and artist Tina Takemoto about Isa, who then did more research that's included in the Seen and Unseen exhibit. So I am pleased and delighted to introduce A.T. Furuya, who will introduce our panelists.
Hi, Stan. Thank you everyone for joining. And Stan, thank you for taking that moment earlier to honor the victims and the victims' families. You know, it's been a hard week for so many of us, just unsure, what does all of this mean? This violence that continues to happen and unfold, what does that mean for safety for ourselves and for each other? I immediately was worried about my mom, who, you know, works in a flower shop, and thinking about my family members who are out, you know, my aunt, everyone. And so I just, like, I hold a lot of care for our folks, and I'm thankful to be on this panel. I know that the people joining us today have so many amazing things to share with us, and I'm just really deeply honored to be in conversation with them, and for being able to constantly learn and open myself up to concepts that I haven't, you know, I'm learning too, and I'm just very thankful and privileged to be able to be in this space to learn together with everyone on this call as well. I'm actually going to, if it's okay, invite the panelists to introduce themselves. If folks can share your name, your pronouns, where are you right now in the world, and a little bit about yourself. And if we could start with Tomo.
Putting me on the spot, I see. Okay. Hi, my name is Tomo Hirai. My day job is working with the Nichibei Weekly, the Northern Californian Japanese American newspaper. And otherwise, I am also the editor for Anime Feminist, a online publication doing feminist critique of Japanese pop culture. And my brain just blanked. What else was I supposed to talk about?
Yeah, that's perfect. Anything you want to share about yourself as we kind of introduce the panelists before we jump into questions?
I think that's good.
Okay. Mia, do you want to go next?
Okay, I'm unmuted. I'm Mia Yamamoto. I am a criminal defense attorney, civil rights attorney, community activist. I'm a transgender woman of color. I'm involved with a whole bunch of community groups, a whole bunch of bar groups, a whole bunch of Zoom calls. So, I mean, let me just say this. We'll be talking about intersectionality. We're talking about queer identities, people of color, also talking about the oppression that has been highlighted by the horrors of this past week, and what it means for the future, what it means to all of us. That's where I am right now.
Thank you. JJ, do you want to go ahead and go next?
Hi everyone, I'm JJ. I go by JJ Ueunten. I go by they, them pronouns. I am a massage therapist and also work at the Japanese American Service Committee in Chicago. And I also do stuff with a group called Nikkei Uprising in Chicago. It's a group of Nikkei activists and organizers, and then also do some stuff with Sudo for Solidarity.
Thank you. And Elliott?
Hi, comrades. This is Elliott Fukui. I use he, him pronouns. And for folks who can't see me right now, I am a Nikkei Hafu person with short curly brown hair under a black cap, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt that says evict the landlords. And I'm currently in Ohlone territory, or the Bay Area in Oakland. And right now I am a community educator with the Fireweed Collective. And we do work around healing justice and mental health, specifically in queer and trans BIPOC communities. And I also do community security work and get to hang out a lot with the folks at A-Pink in San Francisco. And a lot of my work right now is centered in bringing healing justice and mental health awareness into our organizing spaces. And I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for for introducing yourselves. As Stan had said, I'm AT Furuya. I use they, them pronouns, and I also am part of the Asian Solidarity Collective here in San Diego, which is an organization primarily made up of different NHAPI folks, and then also we do solidarity work here in San Diego. It's local, so we show up for Black Lives Matter organizations and just any delivering food to folks on the border who are seeking asylum and constantly being denied, and then living in really terrible conditions. And then also part of a mutual aid group called We All We Got San Diego, and making sure that our folks are housed and fed. So that's where a lot of my extra work right now is going to, and bringing my aunt, who I found out recently, I think it was recently, Mia was born in Poston. I think you were in 3 and she was in 1. So, I think we'll also hear a lot of from folks who are who have that history connection to the American concentration camps during World War II, and impact that's had over generations as we have this conversation as well. So thank you, everyone. Let's get started. And for folks listening in on the call, please drop your questions. I think, just in the chat, if you can throw those in, and Stan's going to monitor the questions, and then we'll be able to come back to them or continue on if it fits well. I'll do my best. It's hard for me to concentrate on multiple things, but I'll do my best. And then for the panelists, obviously, they're whatever they're comfortable and feel safe answering. We're not going to add pressure or anything, so we'll definitely facilitate the questions in a way that feels good for the panelists as well. So don't be afraid to ask your questions, please. So my first question, actually, to start us off, and this is more directed at Mia, so if you can unmute yourself, because this question's for you, is how did older Japanese Americans navigate trans identities in an era of rigid gender roles? And I'm thinking specifically, Mia, like how you have kind of experienced your identity, and going back further, just your knowledge and what you observed and experienced.
Being transgender and coming up in the Japanese American community was an exercise in invisibility. As a matter of fact, invisibility was what I was hoping for, as a matter of fact, during the course of that time. So I came out at an older age, and I think that my experience with just being transgender, because anybody who's transgender has been transgender, at least aware of it since they've been about 5 years old. And I think that across the board, that's been my experience with all the people I know. But as an older trans person myself, let me just say that in terms of the atmosphere of either acceptance or rejection is actually better with younger people. So it's almost, you can actually predict that the older, the more Nisei, the community, the more they're imbued with a sense of, if you're going to do something like that, then you're going to shame all of us, so to speak. Maybe they'll think all JAs are queer, which would be the most horrible thing that these people could imagine. So of course, a lot of these folks, and you know who they are, I know who they are, are very evident, very vocal. But I think that they learn. And I think they're learning from the generation that's coming up after us. Thank goodness things are more enlightened, more accepting, more aware. And I think that just like anything else, your stereotypes and images die hard. Your prejudices and other forms of bias die hard. Reality needs to be brought to people. And I think that transgender people, we're a pretty minuscule minority, but we need to assert our presence in society to make sure that we can be protected as well as anybody else. Once we realize that we have as many rights as any other individual, then we know that that's the right thing to do. Asserting those rights, asserting ourselves is the right thing to do. So I think as an older trans person, that's the one message that I have, is that whatever pushback you get from whatever generation, being your authentic self is well worth it.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about kind of the historical trauma that our community has experienced in the US over time, and that kind of feeling of like, I have to assimilate in order to survive, or what does it mean to like not be harassed on a daily basis or attacked or discriminated against, and holding that that fear from the Japanese American community. And then also how, sometimes in our own oppression, we tend to like extend that to other people within our own community. And maybe that wasn't the intention, but that kind of happens subconsciously. So yeah.
I think the camp experience very specifically, because I feel like I could speak to that, because you're right, that's where I was born. But the main thing was I grew up with it. I grew up with the witnessing of the experience and the generational trauma that went with it. And you're right, the need to fit in, to not be the nail that gets hammered down, and used all those analogies that our parents gave us, was because of vicarious liability. It's like we were going to be held responsible for the actions of others. Look at Pearl Harbor. Some Japanese people went out and did something, and all the rest of us had to get locked up for it. I think that attitude and that experience, that trauma, leads to a certain hypervigilance, like most post-trauma. So I think that's what I saw, that's what I experienced. I still sort of see that today. Maybe that's one of the reasons why that generation still hangs on to so much convention and are so alarmed at any kind of unconvention.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. And I want to open this question up to the other panelists. If you're comfortable, will you share how you navigated your gender identity and also your connectedness or disconnect with your Japanese identity and / community and other identities that you hold? I feel like from now on, whoever unmutes themselves first goes.
I feel like I'm James Dean or something. Anyway, I guess I can talk about myself a little. As far as me coming, getting to know myself as a trans woman, I figured it out, mid high school-ish or so, 2005, if you want to date me like that. And it was a time when trans and LGBT issues were just kind of starting to, be brought up in common discussion within younger generations. But as far as my connection to it with the Japanese American community, it wasn't really a thing. Everyone around me was, from what I've seen, what I could see, as far as I could see, straight and cis. So it was something that I only really connected with other people who were LGBT and visible. So it turns out like most of my social circles, especially my queer social circle, is white, and it always kind of has been. It got a little bit more diverse in college, but definitely generally diverse. And seeing trans representation in Japanese media wasn't very flattering. So it was something that also kept me further in the closet, to my parents at least. For those of you who don't know, I'm Shin Nisei, so I have my parents are from Japan, so I feel a little closer to being Japanese rather than Japanese American half the time. And so, being raised on watching Japanese TV, the only representation for trans people that I saw then, real trans people, were, new halves. It's a term used for, that's generally used for people that are working in the sex, well, not really relegated to the sex industry, but people, whenever you see them on TV, it's like, oh yeah, this person works at a new half bar and let's interview them and sensationalize them. And that was something I personally didn't really feel comfortable with so much. Yeah.
I can share a little bit. Well, I'm fourth generation Okinawan and Japanese, and I grew up in Hawaii. And yeah, I think I didn't think super deeply about Japanese American identity, and I wasn't connected to like a thing called the Japanese American community. I think because Japanese Americans have like a certain amount of political power, and then even like Japanese businesses own a lot of land, and I grew up upper middle class, and so there's just kind of, I just didn't think too deeply about race and ethnicity. But I think something that I kind of connect to my Japaneseness was I mean, I remember like even like asserting to a friend when I was very young that I was a boy and I was assigned female at birth. And yeah, I don't even remember what happened, but I think I kind of figured out that that wasn't a thing to do and wasn't safe, even though that particular friend was very, you know, great about it. And so, yeah, I think just until I left Hawaii in when I was 18, like I really didn't deal with queerness at all for myself. And yeah, I think it's just been, I didn't kind of actively or consciously like avoid Japanese American community, but I didn't think about moving toward it at all for like years and years and years. And I found kind of initially some white gay community. I initially came out as gay, and then found kind of queer Asian community and queer Black Indigenous people of color communities, and then eventually kind of, yeah, through thinking about racial justice a little bit more, being like, okay, I need to think about this in terms of like my own identities. And so, yeah, I think like this is like not the experience of all Japanese people, but I feel like kind of my family had like a experience that can kind of fit into like a model minority story. And so like I think I've internalized that, like, you know, anything that I do outside of like expectations is like not okay. And I think I'm trying to figure out like, yeah, like how much I've internalized that story about Japanese Americans and how much that limits my possibility and how much that like makes me see myself as not Japanese American or like lots of other people that don't fit into that box. So yeah, I think, but now because I have kind of supportive queer and trans community, I think that's given me a lot of support to be able to kind of like re-engage with Japanese American communities. And yeah.
Thank you all. I love listening to everybody. So this is Elliott speaking again. I grew up in Minnesota and Ohio, where there are not a lot of us. It's a 98% white state. And so for me, from a very, very early age, I experienced racialized violence. And I was frequently the only Asian kid in school. The first time I experienced hate violence, I got punched in the face when I was 6 years old by a white kid on the school bus, and he called me a China girl. And for me, there was more attachment to the term Asian than Japanese, because the other API communities surrounding me were Laotian and Hmong and Cambodian and Vietnamese folks, right, who had immigrated to Minnesota. So I didn't really fully either similarly really understand what it meant to be, you know, Nikkei. And I think also being Hafu, um, is also complicated. So like I did, you know, go to school in Japan for a period of time, and experienced a different kind of violence, xenophobic violence, where, you know, folks would call me enemy because I was American, right? Or my race would be completely kind of, I was racialized differently. So for me, the race thing became very obvious to me from a very early age, that I would not be safe because of my race. And I think in that, I think I got a little bold and sassy about it as a young person, and I'm really grateful to all of my elders for making it possible for for me to be a little bold and sassy as a teenager, because I also was very much so in psychiatric systems from a very early age. And that did have to do with my gender identity, and that did have to do with my disabilities. And so any kind of violence that I was experiencing, whether that was in hospital systems or the police or social workers or in the streets, right, trying to get around, I think, yeah, that intersection. And as I've gotten older and more connected, uh, both to my Japanese heritage, and I'm half Irish, um, that has supported me in my resilience. Actually, reading my elders' stories and seeing what we have survived, also seeing the horrible things that we have done, right, in our communities, but also yeah, that is what has enabled me continually to be my full self, is seeing those reflections like Mia, seeing reflections. The first time I knew there was another Asian trans man, it was Chris Hayashi in a YouTube video, right? I had no idea there were other trans Asian people. I was living, in the whitest place on earth, it felt like. So yeah, so just to say, while I have this opportunity, thank you to my elders for surviving and for being visible in the ways that you could, because I think that enabled me to be able to show up more fully as myself. So thank you.
Thank you. I also, just to add, Elliott, actually, when I was navigating my trans identity, I was like, and I actually grew up in the Japanese American community in San Diego, going to like the Bon festivals and the Japanese picnic by the JCL down here. But I did not know of any queer or trans people. And I feel like I was on Instagram and I was like looking at hashtags, and I feel like I found Elliott. It was like Riku Matsuda and Chris Hayashi and Kiyomi Fukushima, or no, Fujikawa. And I was like, oh my God, there's Japanese trans people. And I can't tell you like that feeling of like, oh my God, I'm not the only one out there. And these folks have been like living their lives. And that was such a moment of feeling like grounded and less alone. Even though I didn't know you all, and I was like, I'm gonna get to know them. So thanks for taking my friend request. Yeah, and so that also, I think, thinking of folks on the panel is like, how have we found each other? How have we found our people, our support, in whatever way that looks like for you? If folks want to jump in and share, because I think if there are folks on the call thinking, I've never had the opportunity to even think about what gender means to me, and that feeling of like, oh gosh, what does this mean for my life? And what, that like it, if y'all can share kind of how you found support, where you found support, and maybe that is a way to help. I also just lift up like Okaeri is another, the event that I know Marsha Izumi is like a major like passion project amongst others, and JJ, and that Okaeri event bringing LGBTQ plus Nikkei folks together was also just, I've never been in that kind of space before. So we do have resources for folks who are like starting to wonder and say like, yeah, what about, and also that there's no age limit. Like there's not I have to figure out my gender identity or my sexuality by the time I'm X whatever age. So I want to throw that out there for folks listening on the panel. I actually want to jump, because for time's sake, I want to get to the Q&A of folks on here. So I want to go ahead and move on to question number 2, which is, how are trans folks in our community forging awareness within Nikkei communities and beyond? So this being an example, right? Like here's one example. We're on this call today, you're sharing about identities, but what are some other ways that we know young folks, you yourselves, are raising awareness around trans, non-binary, gender identity, and concepts to Nikkei folks, and what does that look like?
let me just say that just being a minority in the court system anyways is in its own way forging a path. I mean, when I came out as a transgender trial lawyer, there had never been one before. And so I had to sort of kind of navigate this by instinct. And the main thing was it was going to be a major change for my milieu. The courthouse is a very conventional place in many ways. And transgender people, I mean, they barely acknowledge gay and lesbian people in that profession. So being trans was something unusual. So I had to make sure that whatever I did was decisive and that it was as open and notorious as possible. So there was no element of stealth. And so if you talk about, I can tell you how it feels like. It's a very interesting way because there's really no roadmap, there's no precedence and no real role models. It's a job and a role that has just never been filled with a trans person before. So I had to experience that after years of being a trial attorney, and that was a good advantage on one level because I already established some level of credibility and acceptance within that community. So going through transition on the job was not as strikingly, what can I say, unsettling. Because, for instance, if you come out on the job as gay or lesbian, you're probably going to look the same tomorrow. Coming out trans on the gig, on the job, in front of so many people in a very public place, there's a whole bunch of mini epiphanies and revelations that are going on. And you just have to sort of be aware of it, try to navigate it. But you know, it's as an experience, I'm really too close to it in many ways to even describe it for you.
You know, yeah, talking about sort of the decisiveness, definitely when I came out to all of the in public as a reporter at a newspaper, same sort of action was required. I came out late 2016, right after Trump was elected. It was and I did it in an op-ed for the paper, basically saying, you know, hey, Trump got elected, and now a lot of trans people, not just Japanese Americans, not just, minorities, people of color, but trans folks too. And so that's how I came out, because I knew I'd had to really just kind of make that statement to everyone out there that I am trans and to be recognized. And this was in 2017. When I was going to college too, I had one foot in the closet, one foot out. Same deal. I just one day just got sick and tired of it and just started, dressing in femme every day, like going to class saying, okay, you know what? I'm not gonna try to kid I'm not gonna try to hide anymore. There's definitely those moments whenever I feel like I need to put my foot down.
Can I also just say I love your collar? Like, you're rocking the collars and they look amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, well, first I do want to say that Okaeri was like the place where I met AT, I think, or I can't remember if that was at, I can't remember, but I think AT and Mia, so that was a big place where I kind of found support in. I think, like, I come out in every Japanese American setting I'm in, every Nikkei setting I'm in, and I think, just kind of doing that is a certain thing, and having kind of conversations with people and trying to navigate when I can have conversations. but I think I've been met with a lot of like people wanting to support, and then I think trying to get my pronouns right, and yeah, experiencing a lot of disappointment around that. And I think something I'm thinking about is the need for a larger gender conversation, because I think people read me as a woman and then are trying to make a change around just language. And so it's not that I'm necessarily doing this yet, but I'm trying to think about what are the larger gender conversations that we can have. And I'm thinking about that, especially I'm just noticing the absence of that, especially in like light of what happened in Atlanta, and we just aren't talking about patriarchy and sexism and stuff like that. So yeah, something I'm thinking about now. And I think like if people kind of had a broader view of gender, that would make it easier for like people to kind of see me or call me in the way that feels accurate to me or authentic to me.
Let's see, I'm like, this is I've been a community organizer since I was 15. And so I've been out for 20 years and doing the work for about 20 years and have seen, you know, from Train's tipping point to to today, sort of how we've been going. I had actually a really beautiful opportunity to train a JA church in Berkeley that had a young person who had come out as trans, and the whole congregation decided that they wanted to come together and get trained and figure out how to best support this young person. And it still like tears me up, right? Right, to imagine just a whole congregation being like, we have no idea, right? But let's figure this out together. And that actually seeing, I'm imagining how that would have changed my own coming out experience, right? And my own ability to feel connected. I grew up in a Buddhist in Soka Gakkai International. And so there were, you know, ways that I was taught that transition was vanity and that I wouldn't be able to attain enlightenment in this lifetime if I physically transitioned. I put off my transition for almost 10 years after I had come out because I was grappling with what that actually meant, right? So I think every time we come together and we're just actually open to like, hey, I don't even understand what this is, but I want to learn because our young people are worth it. And because each of us is worth it. Gender is oppressive to everybody. Like these these binaries impact all of us. So it's also not just for T, G, and C people, it's for everybody who has been told no or restricted, right, because of how they identify and move through the world. So I think that's some of the best work, I think, is getting to be in communities who are like honest about we don't know, but we're going to figure it out together. So
I just want to say I forgot to mention my pronouns. They are she and her. Everybody was like real good about it except for me. I just want to say that thing about forging, you know, paths and stuff like that. I remember when the first time I came to court dressed, you know, came there, would park the car, got in the elevator, went up to court. That was kept thinking was, I'm going to liberate the criminal courts building. And then tomorrow, I'm going to liberate the jail. And then I'm going to liberate the sheriff's department, the DA's office. I'm going to liberate everything. They're going to see a transgender lawyer. They never see anything like that before. And, you know, I just have to say, though, every time, because there weren't very many Asian Americans, period, when I first started practicing as a public defender in 1974. So I always kind of felt like an emissary from my tribe. which meant that I had to be exemplary. That's like a Japanese thing, call it a Buddha head thing. You got to get out there and you got to really be exemplary, because there's a whole lot of people that are counting on you to make it easier for everybody else. And so I knew that being a trans lawyer, in the same vein, I was an emissary of my tribe, and I had to be exemplary. I couldn't possibly be anything less than the best I could possibly do, because people are counting on me. There's people who are going to be using me as an example when they're looking for hiring or letting people go into law schools, those kinds of things. So that was in the back of my mind, probably from having gone through the whole Japanese American in the public defender's office experience. So that it probably made me the right person to do it, much as, hey, there's no transgender person that wants to do this thing. It's just, oh, what a great, glorious and wonderful thing, It's going to be tough, it's going to be hard, and you're going to have to really stick to your guns and be yourself and cling to that authenticity. Just always kind of remind yourself that you got a right to be real. It's your life. I had to keep reminding myself that, because as a lawyer too, I mean, you serve others. Your lifetime is given, your career is to serving others and trying to help others. So there's a lot of folks riding on your shoulders. And the last thing you want to do is let them down. So there was a lot that went into transition. I had to make sure that I performed at a high level, both before and after.
Thank you for jumping in and sharing your pronouns and also adding that. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of trans folks still experience that, of being the go-to information desk for everyone wanting to know about trans people. And so that is a lot of emotional and sometimes physical burden on trans people to have to always be the ones in the spotlight, educating, being the go-to, and so I just want to acknowledge that work, and thank you for that. I'm going to jump into our next question, which is on intersectionality, because I think it's really starting to, I'm hearing it a lot in our current conversation. And this was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, like a little over 30 years ago, a law professor at UCLA and Columbia. And recently, I think with the use of this term, it's kind of like, wow, this is the word of the century or the decade. And recently, in an interview with Time, Kimberly Crenshaw, as like an updated kind of, here's what I meant for it, said that it's basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. So thinking about that definition from Crenshaw, and then thinking about the recent, as we've been talking about the recent tragedy in Georgia, which has created so many different responses in mainstream media. And I've noticed that a lot of the conversation veers into this, like, attacking the white terrorists and calling for more police presence. And then like, what are we missing when mainstream media makes this sound like an isolated incident?
I think that we can't be too moved by the narratives that are taking place right now. There is a certain opportunistic message that is saying that somehow or other tragedy against the Asian American community requires a police response. This time of criminal justice reform needs a much broader perspective and a far broader application of resources and ideas than just brute force. This has not worked in the past, and this is what, to me, incited the violence against Asian Americans, is the idea that the answer to problems is brute force. It is not brute force in any context. It is an opportunity for education, advocacy, and let me just say this: we can operate with respect to our allies. We need each other. We need solidarity. We are never going to be in solidarity with Nazis, fascists, and white nationalists. We just need to defeat them. We need to unite to defeat them, but they are not part of any kind of a coalition or alliance or anything else that we need to be. They simply need to be defeated.
I think going at the root of everything, it's about racism, right? So it's not so much, you know, because Asian Americans are being affected today that suddenly we turn around and say, oh, we need more cops or something like that. I feel like this is all an extension of last year, when, you know, Black Lives Matter became the huge, you know, became this huge movement in June. I feel like, you know, I don't see a disconnect at all. Although the faces, the victims change, it all goes back to white supremacy. And so, yeah, no, it's definitely all about going, defeating white nationalism in this country, and having conversations to show that, you know, this is what America is, a lot of the times. We have a huge race problem, and it's not the people, you know, it's not BIPOC folks that are the problem here.
Mia, you're muted.
Just want to say that the Atlanta murderer reflects a certain right-wing incitement that has a lot of slogans. And I hate to say it, but one of their slogans is Blue Lives Matter. And I agree that a lot of cops, I'm in the business, know a lot of them, I love a lot of them. But the answer to anti-Asian violence is not more police, not more police funding. It is absolutely a matter of putting a answer and a counter narrative to the white supremacists and the gun nuts who want to solve their problems with guns and ammunition. There's a whole culture that gives rise to this murderer. He does not represent the best of white culture by any means. He is a reflection of a certain indoctrination that takes place, that happens when fascist movements take hold of the media. I don't think anybody should mistake where this is coming from. And I definitely don't want them to mistake what they think the answer needs to be. It is certainly not violence. It is certainly not more violence. It is not longer prison sentences. We have to look at this in a much more holistic way. And I mean, that includes all of society, including the people in prison.
Yeah, I think something that Mia said was like opportunistic use of the murders that happened. And I think like something that happened in Chicago was like the day after these killings happened, the mayor was like, we're gonna send police into all Asian neighborhoods. And I think it's just yeah, some of us were talking about in Chicago, like people don't even have time to grieve or like settle or like figure out what the people who were killed would have wanted or what their families would have wanted. And it's just like, it just feels like and there is like a system kind of waiting to inject more police and more state violence. And yeah, it feels like as an Asian person, like that's not how I want like our stories to be used. That's not fair to us. And yeah, I just want to add that. And getting kind of, yeah, it just, that's, yeah, that's all I want to say right now.
I think probably Japanese American people and Japanese people better than any other group of BIPOC understand the consequences of aligning ourselves with white supremacy and aligning ourselves with fascism. And that the long-term implications of violence against Asian women, right, across the board, that, right, as someone who's an Asian man identified person, the question that I have to ask right, is, what are we doing? What are we doing to examine misogyny, right? I know my first encounters with misogyny and sexism were in my family and in my own community. What are we teaching our young female assigned people about themselves? How do we discuss things like sex work in our community? How do we engage with the reality that as trans Asian folks, a lot of us will engage in sex work or be forced to engage in sex work, right, in order to survive at some point. I know, like, the shame, the silence, the shame, right, that so many of us carry from being told, right, this is what it is to be a woman or a man, or the shame we carry about not being, in my case, am I Japanese enough? No, I'll never be Asian enough. I'll never be white. I'll never be masculine enough, right? I'm 5'1". I'm not going to be like some Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of guy out here, right? I will never be like what this white supremacist patriarchal fantasy of masculinity is, right? So the question I've been asking myself really has been like, can we all align on agreeing that this is harmful, that when we do not talk about, right, when we do not talk about sexual violence in our own communities, when we do not talk about the legacies of imperialism and how that has enforced and continues to play out in so many countries, right, the use of sexual violence, and particularly targeting women and children, right, and the feminine. So this has been 10,000 years in the making, right? This, even just the American portion of it, right? We have built into our cultures these things. And so as a trans person who is impacted by the gender binary, as someone who was assigned female at birth and understands the fear of navigating the streets as an Asian woman, and as an Asian trans person, that we have a responsibility to speak truth. We have a responsibility to have honest conversations about what we were taught to think about ourselves and each other. And we have to do that openly. Because just like we were talking about seeing that one person, right? For me, as Chris, I actually read for this one person speaking openly about that experience can change like a whole generation being able to have a conversation, right? That we all need to have if we're going to change this.
I just want to put in a word for the first support groups that I ever knew as a person that was cross-dressed in the streets were transsexual prostitutes, sex workers, many of whom have been put out of their homes when they were 12 or 13 years old, and had to struggle and did end up selling drugs, sometimes stealing things and selling themselves. I met some of the bravest, most noble people I've ever met in my life in some of those support groups, where the only people I could talk to and who knew anything about my life were street queens. And so I always stand up for sex workers because I've known too many of them to put them down, and their lives are so much harder than the people that they think they have a right to judge them. So that's pretty much all I got to say about that, except the one thing. Kimberly Crenshaw has had her finger on the pulse. She would understand, and she gives you the way to look at the rash of murders of Black transgender women, talking about what forces coalesce and synthesize for the purpose of harm, of murder, violence. We see these forces at work that we're talking about and that happen in Atlanta, and they are intersectional by very definition. And again, I agree with the other panelists. We all struggle with what's next. You know, what do we say? What do we do? This panel is a lot because we carry the weight of that conversation and those issues right here with us. But I feel the same frustration as everybody. I think, what do we say? What do we do? It's the same organizing, the same solidarity, the same resort to our allies for the purpose of a unified movement. All that's great. It's not going to stop this kind of violence. It just won't. Gun control there is no gun control, not in this country. And wackos, and I hate to say this, but part of what happened to this particular murderer, this deranged individual, was religion. And I'm talking about fundamentalist evangelical type religion that absolutely politicizes sexuality. So I blame a whole lot of forces, but that's one of them that's operating to discriminate and harm LGBT people as well, which is religious fundamentalism. And that across the board. I'm not just naming Christianity, they're all of them are guilty of it.
AT, you're muted.
We're a year into the pandemic and I'm still a rookie at the unmute yourself. I was just saying, like, deep breath right now because that was a lot. I think a lot to hear from our panelists, a lot for our panelists to share. Yeah, and so I appreciate you all being open to talking about your experiences as well as just kind of making sense of what's going on and things that we know have existed, but we've just been silent about, such as patriarchy, such as sexism, even within our own community. And so I think, you know, we're moving into the part of our kind of structured conversation more towards what does solidarity look like? What does support for trans folks in the Japanese American community look like? But before we get there, I think something to talk about is what is solidarity? Like, we're throwing this word around like solidarity this, and I think folks for the most part have an idea of what solidarity work is or what we mean when we see solidarity. But I would like to hear from the panelists, what does this mean to you? How do you engage in, I mean, solidarity is an action. It's not something that's just like, I have my solidarity flag behind me and that's it. It actually requires us to do things. And so what are kind of some of the fundamental pieces of what solidarity is to you? And how can folks think about that as they're thinking about, you know, what's going on either in their immediate lives, if they're like, hey, I want to be in solidarity with trans folks, I want to be in solidarity with Asian femmes and women, and like, how do I do that? What are kind of some of your 101 solidarity things you want to share? How are you engaging? Because I think, again, I think this is one of the most important, and I'm hoping that folks on the call, this is one of the most important takeaways from this conversation today.
From my point of view, solidarity starts with the individual conversations that we have with individual people. Those conversations, when we're dealing with people from groups, then extend out to the groups. And all of the work I've ever done that I felt at least had the broadest effect was coalition work, was alliances. It's interesting because I started off thinking that allyship was just a nobility thing, but it's a necessity. I remember listening to the Frederick Douglass quote that when he fought against slavery, it was for himself. That when he fought against racial discrimination, it was for his people. But when he fought for the rights of women, he found some nobility there. He was doing something apart from his own particular self-interest. And I thought of that for many years as noblesse oblige. It was nobility. It was your responsibility as a person who strives for nobility. But I think it's a necessity. I no longer see it any other way except a necessity. We need each other. We need each other, and it's the only way that we're ever going to go forward. But I'm just saying, and I've always said this, there's certain people we don't need. I'm not recruiting any Nazis into this movement, but everybody else needs to be there for their self-interest, because there is a corrosive element out there in our society, and 70 million people voted for that vile element, and we need to be organized against it. It's just all I can say is that we have to advocate for that, for unity, for solidarity against fascism, because it's imminent, it's out there, it has its proponents, and it has its figureheads. And I think that that's where the fight is. There's no compromise there. But I do think that we have to take care of our brothers and sisters in every other oppressed community. That's where solidarity starts, in my opinion. There's people who are getting nothing out of this government, out of this society. They need to be organized against the status quo. It's like that as long as I've been organizing out there in the streets, and it's true today. The only way to shake up the status quo is with a grassroots movement that is absolutely active and relentless.
I think it's also really important to listen to other people. As people, you know, as a trans woman, as a trans woman of color, I feel like I know what oppression feels like, but I only know my own personal experience and the hardships that I've faced, and you know what people have said to me. I don't know for certain what other people are going through. What, you know, I can't just say like, oh, I'm oppressed too, so I understand. Like, I can never understand unless people tell me this stuff. So it's really important that you listen to other people, explain what's, but also I also understand, like, even though, well, yeah, listen to other people first of all, but then you don't expect people to explain it to you either. Because that's also labor on them that you're expecting. So making an effort to understand what they are doing and listening when they are speaking and doing your own research.
I think like this kind of goes to something that Elliott was talking about in terms of like gender conversations that aren't that like, yeah, we have a lot of silence around, and just that like you know, there's something about systems of oppression where like wherever you kind of are in the system, even if it privileges you or even if you're in an oppressor position, like it still hurts us. So I think like something important in solidarity is kind of understanding, you know, both how we're oppressed by it, but even if we're in like an oppressor position, like how it restricts us from being fully ourselves or yeah, fully free to connect with people how we want to or anything like that. Yeah.
I think true solidarity is in relationship development. And I feel like Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, and so many folks really offered us some concrete tools for how we think about this, right? This is actually about having meaningful relationships with people who are different from us. I cannot say any thought I have is original, right? I was raised in multiple communities across multiple states, in different movement work, right? Like everything that I am is an accumulation of the relationships and the context that I have around me. Um, and as someone who's done a lot of like coalition and solidarity work, you just stay consistent and you stay showing up. Trust is not given, and especially in communities like ours that have frequently been, right, just trauma tourist sites. Like people want to get their training so they can get their certificate and say they're trans competent. Like we know when we're being played or used or tokenized. Um, Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years to build enough trust with somebody, right, to be able to get in crisis, right? We should actually be investing as much time and energy as we can in really developing and blossoming our relationships with one another across our differences, because until we're human to each other, this is what's going to keep happening, right? People do not see Asian women as people. People do not see trans people as people. So when we're thinking about, some people don't see Black people as people, right? Like if there's a way that you see how you can dehumanize somebody, and don't kick yourself for it, because we were all socialized in it, right? We were all socialized watching the same news programs that, you know, demonized all of us, and we all internalized that, right? You're not a bad person. That's important to remember. But in solidarity work, it is that openness, it's the flexibility, it's the understanding that if I don't get it the first time, I have to come back, and I have to keep coming back, right, until I understand and I've developed the trust, right, to be able to actually deploy meaningful solidarity. And so make friends, talk to your neighbors, like build authentic relationships.
Oh, I did it again. Thank you. I'm excited because this is bringing up some questions in the chat that I'm adding to our list. And so we have about, just for time check, I believe we have 10 minutes left. And I want to jump to real quick, well, not real quick, but just before we jump into the Q&A, I also want folks to know that like there's more to being trans, like trans folks, especially on the panel, than like being trans. So I think like folks think we walk around with this like capital T on our forehead of like, this is my life and this is all I do. But like, I know that what's really wonderful about the panelists is that they're really awesome people, you know, beyond their trans identity and being Japanese American. So I wanted just to like kind of like shift, and again, like we've been talking about such heavy things and intense or maybe tense things as well. And just to like, what are some of the things that bring you joy? What are your hobbies? What are, you know, just some of the things that are really rocking your world right now, that are not just like in kind of these harder conversations? So I know, yeah, like who wants to start there, but just to get a little bit more understanding that trans folks are more than their identities.
Like a whole bunch of trans people, I'm a rock and roll musician. So I've been playing dance for about 30 plus years on the streets of LA. We played the Hollywood Palladium, the Palomino Club, played a bunch of country rock and rock and roll joints. Just recorded some videos for the National Lawyers Guild dinner, recorded Get Up, Stand Up for them, and they played all that stuff's virtual, right? Doing video music for a number of progressive organizations who are doing their dinners and stuff. And I have to say, playing music, rock and roll music for people that are dancing is the greatest feeling I've ever had in my life.
I can go and oh, you want to go?
Go. Okay. Yeah, I like cooking and eating a lot, and I like singing a lot too. I sing all the time, even though, yeah, I'm not like any kind of wonderful singer. I just love singing, and so I do it all the time.
We'll get together and play sometime. We'll do some duets. I love doing harmony music, my favorite thing. Oh, we did a
I'll
song
back up
for
on the
the,
ukulele.
yeah, we did a song for the Japanese American National Museum, the First Light exhibit. The song on the video for Steve Tatsukawa. Um, I wrote that and performed it with my nephews. That recording is traveling with the exhibit.
Uh, yeah, ukulele. I do a fair amount of. I'm a super sci-fi fantasy nerd, so I'm really big on anything having to do with outer space or vampires in outer space. Um, and what else do I do for fun? I have a dog. She's my emotional support animal. But she really loves throwing her body in tall grass. I'll have to document this and share this with everybody somehow. But there's nothing more joyful than watching a dog just like repeatedly throw their body into the grass and be joyful. So that's one of my favorite pastimes as well.
You know, I haven't touched my saxophone in 10 years, but I could probably still make a few notes here and there. Most of my free time, I spend playing video games and reading comics. I feel like comics and watching anime is definitely more of a work thing for me now, given the work I do. But I still get a fair amount of enjoyment. People tell me my taste is trash, which is great because I'm enjoying myself and I get to make other people suffer for it.
Oh, this is amazing. Stan, I don't think we knew that everyone was so musically connected and gifted. So yes, and I also love watching trash TV. And who cares? That's what we love to do. That's what brings us comfort. And yes, awesome. I actually have been doing a lot of cooking with Auntie Joy. Dominic and I moved back from New York to San Diego to be caregivers for my aunt, and she's been teaching me a lot of cooking recipes. So that's been nice. And I do a lot of I'm really into home fixer, like fixing things up at home. I feel very adult doing that. So I got a rototiller, folks. I'm rototilling the front yard. Great. So I want to move into some of the questions, not to go back to like these more intense, deeper questions, but the questions that some of the folks have been asking. And again, we have, so if the panelists, if we want to maybe like take one or two folks per question so we can get through them. And maybe we can in the chat just say like, I'm going to take this one so we know who, because I feel like we're also running into that politeness of like, no, you go, no, you go. I don't want to speak over anyone, and love that. And also like, please speak. So let's see, I'll move to Elena, who asked, do you think our Japanese American communities can do more to represent LGBTQ plus members? What changes would you like to see in our Japan towns? What are your experiences with trying to make our Japanese American communities more representative LGBTQ plus? Do you worry about protecting your energy when trying to impart change? Drop this question back in the chat so our panelists can see that.
Any business that starts off by saying that their employees announce their pronouns to the people coming into their establishment is a huge step towards signaling acceptance and welcoming.
Just
Yeah.
quickly, I'll
Go-
just say like gender neutral restrooms in spaces are really helpful for some of us.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Kinji asks, listening to this conversation, what I have in mind is if we conceive the idea of unity solidarity, including building allyship, how much importance or weight would our identity have? If we are to employ our Japanese identity, what are our tasks or responsibility to unite with other groups and API communities? And there's the question that
Helping each other adds to the element of, let me just say, leverage with respect to everything that you have. I don't think that going into alliance with other communities dilutes your voice in any way. In my experience, it magnifies the voice. Originally, we organized 17 different bar associations, minority bar associations in Los Angeles. It's up to 22 now. It's called the Multicultural Bar Alliance. It was specifically for the purpose of organizing specialty bar associations from the previously excluded communities from the legal mainstream. And it serves as a good voice. And I think it was a great gesture. And it has worked over the past 30 years to increase intercommunity dialogue between at least the bar associations. And many of those lawyers do represent leadership in those communities. So the dialogue has gone on. There's only one caveat. I will say I've been with that organization for 30 years, and all organizations have a certain tendency towards conservatism. And I think you got to keep up the revolution for some of these organizations to maintain their original momentum and purpose, and not turn into just another defender of the status quo.
Thank you. And then to wrap up, someone, sorry, I didn't catch the name. Someone said for the end of the panel, could you all share places, social media, organizations, publications, where we can follow everyone's amazing and badass work? So actually, if y'all want to, if you want to talk, like this is a great time to plug something that you're like, I really want folks to leave or to like check this out before leaving, or you can also add it to the chat so folks can follow.
I want to put in a plug for International Bridges to Justice. That's www.ibj.org. We represent prisoners all over the world. We started off in Far East, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. We're now all over the world. We're in Africa, in the Middle East, Central Europe. And we minister to the needs of prisoners. We educate defenders, prosecutors, cops, judges, for the purpose of observing the human rights of individuals who are taken into custody. So give us a little check out, International Human Rights Forever.
I'll just drop in a link to Nichibei. I'm sure all of you will, it's somewhat pertinent to all of you in the Japanese American community. We 11 years strong now as a nonprofit newspaper and organization. We do events such as the Films of Remembrance. We've canceled it for this year and last year, the Soy and Tofu Festival of the Northern California Soy and Tofu Festival. We're a fun bunch, so check us out. Also, of course, if you're into Japanese pop culture, anime, manga, anything like that, please check out animefeminist.com. We do 2 articles a week, doing analysis, reports, stuff like that. And then we also do reviews at the very beginning of the anime season for feminist content. Yes.
Anyone else?
I'll drop some links. Okay. So something I do a lot of is safety and wellness planning, and I do that individually and with organizations. I know this past week has been really, really hard and probably has been triggering for a lot of us. At the beginning of the pandemic, I created a Surviving the Apocalypse Together workbook, which is a way for families or pods or communities to think about safety planning in relationship to COVID-19, but also with an increase of hate violence. And that's always free. So that's on madqueer.org, and it's on the first page. There's a button that says Surviving the Apocalypse Together. And it also has a lot more resources in there for other spots for support. And in May, Fireweed Collective, I will be starting an Asian hate violence survivor support group in May with one of my comrades. And we're hoping to be able to work with small groups of folks to get kind of these small healing pods kind of formed so folks can be checking in on each other and taking care of each other. And lastly, check out A-Pink. They're really amazing, dope, baby LGBT youth organizers who are really holding it down. And they have this amazing project called the Dragon Fruit Project, which is an intergenerational storytelling project, which is so lovely. You should definitely check it out.
And I just dropped the handle for Nikkei Uprising's Instagram in the chat, and kind of like in response to Kinji's question, like one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we as Nikkei relate to Japanese imperialism? Yeah, check us out.
We're at time. I appreciate the all of this information. Yeah, and if there are upcoming conferences, Marcia, I see you drop those in here as well. And then also it looks like panelists are dropping in their contact information. I think it's important to also just share, like, Japanese Americans have also been showing up in solidarity. And so, like, as we continue this conversation, I'm thinking of like when 9/11 happened and there was the conversation around incarcerating Muslim folks and people from the Middle East, and how Japanese Americans use the platform to say, like, we're not doing this again. And so it's really around, like, what does it take to activate ourselves? Like, what does it take to say, I'm going to engage in this? There has been solidarity work between the Japanese American communities and the Black communities. And so just thinking about how, you know, the biggest threat to oppression is the solidarity work, is how we continue to work together to figure out, you know, as Elliott had mentioned earlier, like, what does investment in each other look like? And so, you know, I think, yeah, thank you for showing up. And so it's like, how do we continue having these conversations and connecting and building? And I'm just really thankful for everyone, JJ, Mia, Tomo, Elliott, for being part of this panel, to Stan for dealing with my kind of tardy responses. I appreciate you also really, you know, helping us build this moment. The folks that have joined in this conversation, I'm seeing names in here that I'm like, this is, I want to cry. I want to, like, you know, also celebrate to be able to say these words in our communities when sometimes it feels like we can't, and to be able to come together and think about, like, all of these complexities. It's not just one monolith. There's not just one story. There's not just one issue, and that we can work through this together. And so thank you all for joining in, and thanks everyone for participating as well. So Stan, I'm going to pass it back to you before I think we head out. We're about 6 minutes over. So thank you again, everybody.
Totally fine, AT. And for those of you who are not on the panel, please join me clapping using your emojis to thank AT and the panelists for taking us on this really deep and broad conversation. And we weren't able to answer, or they weren't able to answer all the questions. So we're going to formally end the program in just a couple of seconds, but you're welcome to hang out after the program in the Zoom room and ask further questions, assuming that the panelists can stay. And we promise to follow up with you all when the panelists and AT form their band. and go on tour so that you can hear them perform.
I'll be the promoter.
Okay, thank you. You already have. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. There's one more program in this series that's going to take place on April 21st, I think, if I remember correctly, and it's going to explore the intersection of queerness, ethnicity, gender, and the arts. So I hope that you're to join us for that as well.